Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever felt, overwhelmed by how fast technology is changing, just imagine trying to navigate the justice system when that tech is actually being used against you. Today, we're focusing on a really urgent and growing problem: technology-facilitated abuse, or tech abuse. Okay, let's unpack this. We're looking at findings from a really important qualitative study. It focused on survivors in Wisconsin courts who were seeking protective orders, maybe going through a divorce, or even pursuing criminal charges. And the core issue here: tech abuse using devices, apps, data to spy on, harass, control someone is just incredibly prevalent.
Yeah, and for context, we know something like 80% of stalking survivors globally report that technology was used against them.
80%, wow.
That staggering number really makes our mission today feel vital. I mean, the legal system, civil courts, family courts, criminal justice, it's often the only place survivors feel they can turn to for safety, for accountability.
Right.
But this study we're diving into, it's based on these detailed interviews with 19 legal support providers, attorneys, victim advocates, law enforcement folks. And it reveals this massive disconnect.
A disconnect? How so?
Well, our job today is to explore the frankly dizzying hurdles survivors face just trying to collect, prepare, and then present digital evidence of this very modern kind of violence. It really shows a legal system that seems profoundly ill-equipped, especially for crimes that maybe only leave behind these intangible digital traces.
Okay, so before we get into those hurdles, the collection part, let's quickly define the scope. Like, what kind of tech violence are we actually talking about here? What's the evidence people are trying to bring to court?
So the providers, they tended to see evidence falling into about 4 broad areas. First, and probably the most common, is just straight up harassment and intimidation. This is things like direct digital attacks, nasty social media posts, endless messages or calls, sometimes even online impersonation to defame someone or cause serious disruption. Like one example was an abuser actually unenrolling a survivor from university online.
Wow, that's a pretty clear, overt action. I can sort of picture the evidence for that, like a screenshot of a threatening text or fake profile, maybe.
Precisely. Yeah, that's often more straightforward. But the second category, that's where the evidence gets much, much trickier: monitoring and surveillance.
Okay.
This is the location tracking, maybe through shared family apps like Find My, sometimes physical devices like AirTags hidden in a car, or even hidden recording devices, spyware that gets onto a phone or compromises an account. This category really highlights that coercive control aspect.
Right, the control.
Then third, there's image-based sexual abuse, or IBSA. This is evidence about non-consensual capture, possession, distribution, or often just the threat to share intimate images.
That's unfortunately something the legal system is maybe slowly starting to grapple with, but the evidence there is usually the threat itself or the image, right?
Absolutely, yes. And finally, we can't ignore financial abuse. Providers really stressed how often abusers use access, maybe to joint accounts, or even personal accounts they've secretly gotten into to steal money, wreck credit, exert control, often using digital tools. It's a key part of the overall pattern.
So looking at those 4, harassment, surveillance, IBSA, financial evilists, it makes sense that the most common evidence forms are maybe the least sophisticated, like photos, simple screenshots, and the survivor's own testimony.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the study makes a really key distinction here, doesn't it? It seems much easier to prove, say, a harassing text message than to prove you're being secretly tracked.
Oh, significantly harder, yeah. Evidence of covert monitoring, it's often designed to be fleeting or invisible, right? Whereas evidence of a direct threat, like harassment, is usually visible by its very nature. And this is where that whole preparation phase just turns into a genuine gauntlet for the survivor. The study actually identified something like 25 unique barriers just in this pre-court phase alone.
25 barriers, just getting ready for court.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe the most fundamental one is what providers call the intangible nature of surveillance. Survivors often know they're being watched. They see the weird coincidences, they feel that control, but finding concrete proof, it's almost impossible sometimes. One provider put it really well. They said, the technology just makes it so much harder because it's so intangible.
Gosh, that sounds like a horrible psychological burden. You're forced to prove something you know is happening, but you can't physically point to it easily.
It really is. And this intangible evidence, it's often designed to just vanish. Snapchat logs delete quickly. An abuser with remote access might scrub their tracks from the survivor's device before they even think to look for it or try to save it. And this creates this really perverse safety catch-22, which honestly is one of the cruelest findings, I think.
Yeah.
If a survivor blocks the abuser, which is a totally rational, crucial safety step, right?
Absolutely.
They stop the incoming harassment. But stopping that harassment also cuts off the stream of new evidence they might need later to show a continuing threat, like to keep a protective order in place weeks or months down the line.
So wait, you're asking the victim to basically stay a bit vulnerable, to keep that channel open just so they can collect the proof they need to eventually become safe? That feels like an impossible choice.
It is. It really is. And then compounding this pressure is just the sheer information overload. Survivors are often told you need to capture everything, hundreds, maybe thousands of pages of text, sometimes going back years.
Okay.
But advocates pointed out that if a survivor actually brings in too much evidence, the judge or commissioner might just get overwhelmed. They might not review the critical parts, or they might just dismiss the whole thing as disorganized.
So you're essentially punishing the survivor for collecting too much proof of their own trauma. That seems backwards. How is someone who's already under immense stress supposed to figure out what's legally relevant for a specific law versus, the context that actually shows the harm they experienced?
They often can't. And that really highlights the resource disparity. I mean, look, in criminal cases, the state, they can have access to pretty sophisticated forensic tools.
Mm-hmm.
They might use software like Celebrate, which is this specific expensive data extraction tool, or issue subpoenas to tech companies.
Okay, so the state has some power there.
They do, but even the state struggles sometimes. Companies might not cooperate, especially if they're overseas. Or the data, when it finally arrives, comes in, quote, some weird format that needs a special analyst just to make sense of it.
Huh. Okay, so even with resources, it's not simple.
Not at all. Now, flip that.
Yeah.
Consider the vast majority of people seeking, say, a restraining order or dealing with a family court case. These are often pro se survivors representing themselves, no lawyer.
Yeah.
They're relying entirely on really unsophisticated methods, mostly just taking screenshots with their phone, trying to get outside help, like a digital forensics expert, or even just, taking your phone to Geek Squad. That's prohibitively expensive for most people. It can also feel deeply embarrassing. It's just a massive barrier.
Yeah, that financial burden alone would stop so many people, especially when you add in the time pressure you mentioned.
Oh, the timeline is brutal. If you're filing for a temporary restraining order, you often have just 2 weeks, maybe slightly more, until the full hearing. Trying to get technical evidence back, like waiting for subpoenaed logs from a tech company, it's nearly impossible in that time frame.
Just not enough time.
Not nearly enough. And critically, just the act of capturing evidence can escalate the danger. Survivors are often coached by advocates, don't take the bait. Avoid responding aggressively to the abuse, because if you do, the abuser might turn around in court and claim the survivor is just as bad, trying to weaken their case.
Wow. That whole initial collection phase sounds utterly exhausting, dangerous, and just stacked against the survivor simply because the technology moves faster than the legal processes.
That sums it up pretty well, yeah.
Okay, now let's shift gears. Let's talk about what happens when they finally manage to gather something and try to present it in court. You said this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is where new layers of problems come in.
So the first procedural hurdle they hit seems to be just getting the evidence admitted and authenticated. And it sounds like there are basically zero standard rules for digital evidence, leading to just chaos over formatting.
Absolute chaos is a good way to put it. Providers told stories about judges demanding completely different things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, printouts, USB drives, CDs. One advocate mentioned this almost farcical situation where a judge insisted on getting evidence on a CD.
Okay.
Only for everyone to realize the courtroom didn't even have a CD player to view it.
You'd think courts would have figured out USB drives by now. But is the issue just about the format, like CD versus USB? Or do judges actually look at digital evidence with more skepticism than, say, a paper document?
Oh, they absolutely can
Yeah.
apply higher authentication standards.
Mhm.
Decision makers, judges, commissioners, they know digital stuff can be manipulated, right? Screenshots can be faked, texts can be altered.
Right, that makes sense.
So while that skepticism is understandable, it makes digital evidence really vulnerable to being challenged. And providers saw this dangerous thing they called the forged counter evidence trap. Imagine an abuser shows up with their own set of faked screenshots or manipulated texts that contradict the survivor's evidence.
Okay.
A judge, maybe feeling unable to definitively tell which one is real, might just decide to throw out both versions just to be safe.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And that massively disadvantages the genuine survivor because the burden of proof is on them and now their evidence is gone or tainted.
And connecting the evidence to the actual abuser must be tough too, right? When anonymity is so easy online. If I'm getting harassed by, I don't know, Cashboy2960 from a burner phone number, how do I prove that's the person sitting across the courtroom?
It's incredibly difficult, yeah.
Yeah.
Even when law enforcement gets involved, abusers deliberately hide behind these temporary usernames or spoofed numbers. And when they are confronted with digital evidence in court, their attorneys have standard responses. They'll frequently claim, oh, my client's account must have been hacked. Or if a physical tracker is found on a car, they'll just question, well, who really put it there? Casting doubt?
Right. Plausible deniability.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating here from a legal standpoint is this concept of relevance. Sometimes, if an abuser only used some anonymous nickname during the harassment, a judge might rule that the evidence isn't legally relevant because they can't definitively link Cashboy2960 to the actual named defendant in the case. The connection is too murky for them.
That seems like a huge loophole. Which brings us, I guess, to the issue of human bias. Even if you have concrete digital evidence, how much does the case still boil down to whether the judge actually believes the survivor, their credibility?
Almost entirely, it seems. The study really showed that the outcome often hinges on that decision-maker's individual level of tech savviness and, maybe even more importantly, their understanding of abuse dynamics. They might minimize the tech abuse, sometimes treat it as less serious than physical violence. One provider shared this frustration, saying judges often seem to think, I don't really care that they said that thing online. It's not that bad.
Dismissing it.
Yeah, dismissing it. And that lack of understanding can lead to really devastating biases in court. Providers shared examples, like an abuser showing photos of the survivor seemingly happy on vacation, asking the judge, does this look like somebody who's being abused? It's a tactic that totally leverages a misunderstanding of how trauma and control work. But sadly, it's a tactic that decision makers sometimes credit.
It sounds like the final, maybe biggest structural hurdle is just that the laws themselves haven't really caught up with the technology being used.
That's absolutely right, yeah. Many forms of this modern tech abuse, they just don't fit neatly into existing statutes, like the ones in Wisconsin they studied. For instance, maybe just getting lots of harassing phone calls doesn't quite meet the legal threshold for a crime. Or social media defamation might get dismissed by a judge as freedom of speech, interpreted very broadly.
And those legal requirements to prove malicious intent, not just the impact on the survivor, that must create massive loopholes for abusers, right?
Huge loopholes. Proving malicious intent is profoundly difficult. Take GPS tracking laws, for example. They get really complicated if it's between co-parents. The abuser can just claim the tracker was put there for the child's safety.
Right.
Even if the survivor feels certain it was used to stalk them. The legal focus then shifts back to the abuser's stated, often innocent-sounding intent, rather than the actual demonstrable harmful impact on the survivor.
So even if the harm is clear, the intent muddies the water legally.
Exactly. And even in cases where the abuse does seem to clearly fit the legal definition, judges still have the final say at that ultimate discretion. An abuser who seems remorseful in court or promises the judge they'll change, they might still avoid getting an injunction or a protective order issued against them, basically overruling the concrete evidence the survivor managed to present.
So taking all this in, what does it really mean for the person just trying to escape violence? It sounds like the burden placed on the survivor. I mean, from trying to capture this elusive, almost invisible evidence while under incredible stress, to then navigating a legal system full of inconsistent rules, biases, and loopholes. It's just immense.
It really is.
The system, in many ways, seems to be compounding the abuse instead of actually stopping it.
It's a harsh way to put it, but based on this study, it feels accurate. And this deep dive, I think, provides a really vital, maybe two-pronged call to action.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, it's directed squarely at the technologists, the platforms themselves. They have to increase transparency. Companies need to provide much more robust, detailed activity logs. Logs that show, for instance, every single time a location tracking app like Find My was checked. And by whom?
Right, make the invisible visible.
Exactly. And crucially, this information needs to be in a format that's accessible and understandable for survivors. And this is key, without accidentally creating a new way for the abuser to access that same information and monitor the survivor's attempts to get help.
That's a tricky balance. And the second call to action?
The second is for developing real socio-technical solutions right here on the ground. We need specialized, accessible software tools. And these need to be developed with advocates and legal experts. tools that can actually guide survivors through this maze.
Like help them figure out what evidence matters, how to format it.
Precisely. Help them select, prioritize, and format their evidence into a package that's legible, logical, and hopefully court invisible.
Yeah.
We just have to find ways to reduce this overwhelming administrative and technical burden that's currently falling squarely on the individual survivor.
Yeah. Ultimately, the study really drives home how much the outcome for a survivor depends on the individual awareness of the judge or commissioner sitting in front of them. Whether they happen to be tech savvy, whether they happen to understand abuse dynamics.
Mhm.
So if the goal really is a survivor-centered justice system, we have to ask, right? What structural changes, what training changes are most critical? How do we ensure that legal professionals consistently recognize tech-facilitated abuse as the serious violence it is, even when the evidence feels intangible and the crime seems invisible?
Yeah.
It feels like the focus has to shift away from the abuser's often convenient claims about their intent and squarely onto the survivor's undeniable experience of harm.